Thank you very much, Bobby. That was a great introduction and delivered with such enthusiasm. I'm just inspired myself. I enjoy looking out over our group. I understand this is a busy autumn and lots of meetings, but I appreciate and admire all of you who are here and those of you who are able to come annually to what's something we in the Association of Governing Boards consider just critical to state achievement and therefore American achievement in raising the achievements of American higher education and of our students and our competitiveness. Before I begin, I have to just say a couple of things that you Texans might identify with. When I left as vice president in Missoula, which considers itself quite the urban city, and became the chancellor of a college in a smaller town, my brother-in-law told me, he was an elementary school teacher, about a little girl he had who had transferred from Dillon, my new community, to where he was teaching in the state capital of Helena. And the second or third day of school, I think she was a second grader, she said, "Mr. Stearns, I need to talk to you privately." So he was kind of worried, but they went off for a little discussion at recess or the noon hour, and she said, "Mr. Stearns, I see that you're wearing a pink shirt, and you probably should know, maybe you don't, that men do not wear pink shirts." I'm looking around to see if I got any men in the audience in pink shirt. Well, my brother-in-law was amused, but was respectful, of course, and he said he used it as a learning opportunity and gave a little spiel kindly about that, this was a new day and age and that those kinds of stereotypes were not as rigid or as they used to be. So it was really okay. And he said that she kind of put her hands on her hips and looked at him and said, when he concluded with his finale, so it's okay, Sarah, that men can wear pink shirts. She put her hand on her hips and said, "Not in Dillon." So that was sort of the cowboy country I went into, the valley of the little, of the Big Hole River. Great fly fishing and not that far from Yellowstone Park. The other story that I thought of that I just will relate before I kind of forget it, but the emphasis in the 60 by 30 Texas on marketable skills is admirable, just admirable. And I see as, I won't say a new wrinkle in some of the national strategic plans that we're seeing, but its special emphasis is terrific. Certainly ones that make all kinds of sense for people to break out of the no wage or stagnant wage kind of world. But it reminds me of when I went off to school back in the 60s. My twin brother and I both decided to attend the University of Montana, which was 600 miles away. As you know, Montana's a big state too. But Mom and Dad took us over there, and a neighbor said, "Well, what are Peter and Sheila going to major in?" And Dad said, "Well, Sheila's going to major in English. She likes to read books, and she thinks that she can do 4 years of reading books and that will be a lot of fun." But he said, "I'm not going to tell her this, but I'm okay with it because I think she can be a teacher." Of course, it turned out he was right. I sort of last minute got my teaching credentials and started my career in education and loved it and never looked back. But my brother had decided to major in economics. And the neighbor said, "What's he going to do with that?" And my dad, who always was a dentist, very practical guy, and was always trying to convince us to major in something like pharmacy. And we said, no. But Dad said, maybe he'll open an economics store. Parents then as now wanted, and it was with wry humor, but it was also with kind of a shrug of, oh goodness, is he really going to get something out of this that will make him employable? And I'm here to tell you, Peter and I together, and he's been in California these many years, celebrated our 70th birthdays this summer together with some other siblings. And he's done very well for himself with that economics minor. We'll go much farther than that. Marketable skills, and to the extent that you can get it, I forget which one of you spoke yesterday about the inverting of some of your degrees, where you get the practical part, and then when you realize that perhaps you want to become an officer in the military, or you want to become, a leader, a supervisor, and you need the advanced credential, the broad education is good as well. My colleague, Tom Meredith, and my colleague yesterday that many of you met, Kevin Riley, there are about, 20 of us around the country and that work on a consulting basis for the Association of Governing Boards. That's what our AGB stands for. A marvelous organization, as many of you know. Check their website for any number of, and they didn't ask me to make a plug, but any number of sources of, here's an example of one that often I do workshops for boards, and this one on effective governing boards. The reassuring thing about it is you can see how small it is, about the 7 to 10 really top responsibilities that board members need to attend to as the body corporate, as many of you said yesterday. I will tell you about the first time that AGB sort of sent me out into the world to work with a board in a Western state that was, they said, somewhat dysfunctional. Now, I know that will surprise you. Most boards are perfectly functional. And I was taken aback at how at odds these board members were with each other. Generally, we do workshops with boards that they're going along well, but they're not taking, this big banner, they're not taking the next step to really address strategic issues. So that was quite a learning experience. And someone said yesterday, remember someone talking about the woodshed every now and then? And I thought, well, at the end of that particular workshop, the fellow who was clearly the bomb thrower in the group came up to me and he said, "You're not going to guess what my fellow board members are doing. They're getting after me." And I thought, whew, I'm glad to hear that. But I smiled politely, and he said, "They're not letting me be on or chair my favorite committees." Well, I have no idea, in the following 2 or 3 years, kind of how the woodshed played out. And luckily, in my experience in higher education and in the boards I have worked with, that has seldom been necessary. But there are ways for good board chairs, governance committees, to work through that. Now, today our assignment, let me give you a little preview, is to talk about strategic issues. And my colleague Tom Meredith sort of surveyed, because I didn't know I was coming until Sunday. So he had done the initial survey of different sort of range of strategic issues, which I'll run through, and then I'll touch on each of them in a little more depth. But a couple of you have already been put on notice that, such as Yvonne or Bruce, or I'm going to think your first name, Mark, of course, and Calhoun and Miles. Sandra, it's very unfortunate for you if I've already learned your first name, because I have permission from Joe, the cameraman, at the last 10 or 15 minutes that I might be Fred friendly here and take the mic and get out into the room and get your observations on which of these strategic issues you'd like to share an observation, your collective wisdom with the group, or ask a question, rhetorical or otherwise. So there's that. And I've reassured Mary, who runs a tight ship here, that Joe, the cameraman, is prepared for me to wander out a little bit into the group. So just so you're at the ready as well. Bobby, you're not necessarily off the hook either, just so you know. One of our mantras seems pretty obvious, of course, that an institution and a system can only be good, and its CEO can only be as good as the board itself. We heard lots of examples of how that plays out yesterday, and you've heard it in previous leadership conferences, but it is very true. The years that I served as Commissioner of Higher Education, Commissioner Raymond in your role, and I met him in earlier years when I was still wearing that mantle. There were some years in which we were really able to make a difference for our state, and other years not so much, because the board was a little too fractured. And one of the things we heard yesterday is how hard it is to build a culture on your board. Now, especially given all those, can you not even call each other one-on-one practically? You know, those of you who attended the panel and heard the general counsel, that was all good advice, and always ask their advice. But that never, board chairs especially, but all of you, never let that stand in the way of building a strong relationship, a culture among your board, that we are all here for the students. And that means you have to build relationships of trust with each other. So I'll touch on strategic issues, values and goals, your responsibility, and then some questions. So I've got 2 slides that I'm just going to have you take a look at for a moment, that Tom and Kevin and we and others, that are strategic issues you have touched on or you are touching on, or some more specifically addressed in your 60 by 30. But issues relating to funding, to enrollment. I actually, on a future slide, put a question mark beside declining enrollment. It's a really strategic issue for some institutions and not so, maybe almost the reverse for some others. Tuition. You know, the years I was commissioner, the governor and others cooperated to freeze tuition for about 8 to 10 years in a row. To figure out how to do that in Montana meant that you had to form a pact with the legislature that they would backfill what was needed for the increases in pledged or negotiated bargaining agreements, or in inescapable increases in benefits and so forth. In other words, we were not going to cut quality, but if we could have a ceiling on tuition with a grand bargain with state policymakers, we were going to do it. We were able to do it for quite some time. Costs, and I consider the new overtime regulations of the Fair Labor Standards Board, you know, it's risen to a strategic issue with some institutions because it's a budget hit, and also it takes some time to look at what does everybody do? Are they really overtime exempt? You know, so it might seem more tactical than strategic, but it depends on how it hits your budget. Mark, are you looking at these to see this? You get another page too before you decide which of these you might say. I really think that one is strategic for whatever reason. Debt, the changing model of teaching and learning, evidence that the students are coming to us prepared. And by the way, I'm going to make a little side note here. I do want all of you to just raise your hands high in the air if you ever hear me refer to students as kids. I heard a little bit of it yesterday, much less than I used to hear. I learned one of the first times maybe when I was vice president working with our commencement speaker, or maybe when I was president, and wonderful speaker, but she referred to our graduates over and over as kids, you kids. And she did not know that or realize how few of our graduates, they're all over 18 for heaven's sake, and how few of them were even traditional to begin with. So if I do it, I can do it as easily as anyone. Raise your hand to remind me. They are students, they're not kids. And graduation rates and completion, big part of your plan. Retention, loss of world prestige, sexual assault, athletics, sunshine and open meeting laws, affirmative action, deferred maintenance, and ultimately, is college worth it? And are you strategically, as boards, making the case to your students if they come and they have a bad semester or two, they're floundering, what is the value proposition that means completion is something they should continue to focus on? Okay, now, I've just as a way partly of doing my own homework. We'll take each of those, talk about them for a few moments, and then we get to talk about them as a group. But I picked some quotes that interested me. They aren't necessarily the wisdom from Mount Sinai, but they are quotes to stimulate our thinking. One fact is, this source is the Center on Budget Policies and Priorities, but it is a fact in almost any source you would check, that states did cut funding deeply after the recession. The average state, and I've looked at a couple sources, but give or take, dropped its spending approximately $2,000 per student. I've seen $1,800, I've seen $2,100, but give or take, there was a real drop in per state allocation per student, or 20 to 25%, in that range, less than prior to the recession. You all know that, or if you're fairly new to the board, you will realize that people often talk about the good old days when state appropriations made up more of a share. Another strategic issue, of course, is tuition, up or down, or a ceiling or lack thereof. And this report from Inside Higher Education, it was actually quoting Inside Higher Ed, by the way, a great site if you don't subscribe to it. The nice thing about it, if you subscribe to it, it doesn't give you too long each day, but it'll give you a piece, and then you can go further into it if you choose. But quote, the report they quoted from, more than half of the core educational expenses at public four-year universities are now funded through tuition. That doesn't seem like a big mystery, and in some places it's more, as you know. That in some ways seems kind of low to me. But when I was a vice president working with legislators in the 80s, I checked it out, because even then I was appalled at how the state funding per student seemed to be dropping. And I checked it out and discovered that in the 60s, when I was enrolling with my English major and my brother was enrolling with his econ major, that my tuition of $300 per year, $100 per quarter, that the actual COE, cost of education, was about $1,500. So think how little of that actual cost of education I was paying. Just a fraction. Well, now it's, for students, it's either well over 50%, in some cases higher. And that's a reality of a world in which people have aged, including we baby boomers, other priorities of of a slow growth economy. In the 50s and 60s, of course, growing fast enough that maybe states could do that. Not anymore. So costs, that's a strategic issue for any board, community college, university, Division I, you name it. And I like sometimes to quote Carol Twigg. If you're unfamiliar with the National NCAT, the National Center for Academic Transformation, I consider it a marvelous resource. And the Lumina Foundation, which is a grant that we in AGB applied to help support or subsidize our visits to groups like you, the Lumina Foundation, based in Indiana, uses the National Center quite a bit, because what they're always looking for, they're understanding that states they're not going to just say, oh yes, you're the priority, we'll give you more money after all. They can't always. And so they're always expecting us, as a strategic issue, to figure out ways to boost course completion rates, to improve learning and retention, and to increase student engagement. Well, listen to her, this sounds kind of cocky, while reducing per student costs by an average of 30 to 40%. Really? Actually, really. And those of you familiar with her work and their work know that in certain areas in which they are specializing, they are finding models that have been well tested in major universities, University of Georgia, all kinds of places, to see how can you teach math, for example, in a way that uses technology and that doesn't just stymie and stop a student from getting into God forbid, a remedial class or their first math class, and then getting dispirited and never getting out of that rut. Maybe especially when all they needed was 1 or 2 modules, if you will, within that class. Very strategic issue on costs. I'll return to the issue of costs, and if I don't, somebody hold me accountable. Declining enrollment, yes, a real problem, particularly in rural areas that aren't growing fast. But here's a counter report. CNBC reported not too long ago that, or one of their experts that they cited, college enrollment did start to fall kind of as a whole. But then, quote, "We were thinking it could be the tipping point," said Will Kimball, a research assistant at the Economic Policy Institute, but then the trend reversed, and in most institutions it has. Now, yesterday on one of my little news feeds, I discovered that Williston State, Williston, North Dakota, and I pay attention, to, of course, to my region, the states around us. Get this is yesterday in my little news clips, has extended its free tuition program to about 6 counties in eastern Montana. And I thought, really? Free? What's the deal with that? So I did have to dig deeper. What they have done, and of course, Williston's there in the Bakken. It has some resources, even though it's suffering a bit as energy prices fall. However, as I dug, you know what they did, what they are doing for a number of their own counties in western North Dakota is to find a donor and a trust and a source, their foundation work, and they have a trust that funds free tuition for students. By now, they said they've done this for about 600 students in their area, people who have been able to complete, who would not have been able to otherwise, through a public-private partnership. So they have managed to stabilize and strengthen their institution by doing this, and they certainly help students. And I had it up there because I think desperation about perhaps falling enrollment when employment was rising played a role in that. Yesterday, I heard lots of discussion about student debt. You know those facts and figures. I don't need to tell you. It's a strategic issue. Some of the things I found, though, are kind of interesting. I mean, I hope all of you heard yesterday, or something that I think someone on the panel said, or maybe David Gardner, are you here? David, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but this is a major point. A lot of times when you hear the average debt, and Julie, you're here too, and it'll include those $200,000 debts from the medical students and the high value professional graduate programs. Now, I hope that most of the figures either are disaggregated or you ask for that when you're thinking about your undergraduate completers, to make sure the average you're getting is that group. And because, go figure, there's a very low default rate among especially those medical professionals who rack up those $150,000 to $250,000 loans. They actually are pretty good about knowing what's going to pay off. They're developing a very marketable skill. They know they've done their facts and figures and their homework. Again, counterintuitively, it is often community college participants, often if they did not complete, who have the lowest loans, but are most likely to default on those low loans that they have. That is a strategic issue of concern. And a lot of times it's because they didn't complete, they had fewer family resources to help them with those loans once they either finished or maybe dropped out. So, uptick in student debt. World prestige. This is Lumina's one short version of the Lumina Foundation's mission statement. a stronger nation. Post-secondary learning builds the talent that helps us rise. And that is the mission of that large, not-for-profit, well-respected foundation, by the way, that looks at states across the country and looks for ways to pool us together when we have like interests to work on something that will make a difference in our state. Because, again, I heard 13th yesterday, 14th, 12th, in the 30 to 35 accepted developed nations in the OECD list, you know, as you've heard, I think, US used to be number 1 or 2, and it has fallen in terms of the numbers completing credentials, degrees, and significant qualifications. Okay. I don't think we have very many D1 schools represented here this morning, or even maybe very many that have athletic programs. So I won't linger on this, except to say that a very good report, a fairly recent one by, I think her name's Diana DeRocher, working with the American Institute on Research, has a very good piece, I think from 2015, on spending on athletics. And if you are with a school on the governing board, I know the team is dear to your heart. Let's see, Gerald, where's Gerald? He likes the University of Houston. You know, how's your football team this year, Gerald? Yeah, right. I got to sit with him over my glass of wine last night. And believe me, there's not a weekend that I or a member of my family isn't living and dying with what Coach Stitt said about the University of Montana Grizzlies. I mean, I get it. Nobody's, you know, bleeds maroon and silver more than I do. However, when you look at, for example, this report, or just Google Delta Cost Project and see how few schools really pay their way with athletics, and how I think that I'm concerned. There are 3 or 4 colleges, universities in the country that have added Division I football in the last few years. I can't help but wonder, I guess they've made the strategic decision. I'm not going to second guess them from afar, but there are issues there, because here's the deal. Even in the best schools, and my husband graduated from Notre Dame, so he's all snobby about that. And he said, oh, they pay for the athletics. Well, you know what they spend per student athlete compared to the regular per student academically? There is a shocking disparity. And that's what Diana means, DeRocher, in this article. The disparities between your per student, your per capita spending, is a figure you don't always hear. And she suggests, I think with a nice little metaphor there, they maybe should re-examine their game plans, a little bit at least. A strategic issue for all colleges and universities includes sexual assault. How to make sure you as a board are supporting your presidents in having the kind of policies, or, oh, God forbid, they have to have someone help out in their Title IX programs or their Title IX office to make sure that they're responding appropriately and fast. Now, the University of Montana a few years ago was just the absolute poster child for how to do it wrong for a couple. And then after, you know, getting skewered and having John Krakauer write a book about us, Missoula, rape in a college town, oh my Lord, it was terrible. But now we're kind of a poster child with the Office of Civil Rights and others, the Department of Justice, of how to say, okay, we haven't been doing it so great. We are going to admit that humbly and work on being the model for the rest of the country. And they are getting there. I am retired, but that president of that university used to report to me. And there was a point at which our board, you know, had to call him to practically a woodshed to say, are you being really straightforward with the media? What's the deal? This is not good. So I loved what the AAUW has to say about it. And because it really does, it affects the 60 by 30 in any kind of state. It will yours. When I was chancellor at UM Western, the end of my first year, a young woman was kind of end of the year, there's just 1 week left to finals, and a lot of people were out kind of dancing at a local establishment and enjoying it. And she reported the next day that a professor had offered her a ride home. And she accepted because she didn't feel really steady on her feet. And then she said, and he raped me. He didn't take me home. He took me to a motel and he raped me. And I had to write an essay quickly to my faculty and staff the next day to say, and students saying, you have to be schizophrenic. The professor is innocent until proven guilty. On the other side of that schizophrenia, the student must be trusted and believed for the bravery in coming forward. But I knew that she would not finish. She would transfer over the summer or she would drop out. And that is exactly what happens to many, many women, especially young women, is it becomes too much, too embarrassing, too fearful for, if there's much of that kind of culture and it's not being addressed through policies, for them to stay. So it does affect the completer status of many, many of our young people. And by the way, I did a roundtable on this for AGB 2 years ago, and instead of having one table, it was like 6:30 in the morning, I didn't expect hardly anyone. I had 2 roundtables come to this little breakfast conversation on this subject. Half of the people there were presidents or chancellors or board members from online universities. And I thought, what? You know, what does that have to do with sexual assault? And what they explained to me why they were so interested is because opening the door to online collaborative groups also can open the door to online stalking, online pursuit, online acquaintance that has created some dangers for them. So you don't know where that might lead and why your policy should address it. Affirmative action, that, you know, it's been a topic addressed by the courts here in Texas and otherwise. It's well defined by the National Council of State Legislatures, both pros and cons. If you as a board member are ever asked to address that, I suggest you look up NCSL's definition of what are the advantages, historic and otherwise, of a good, strong affirmative action program that passes legal muster, and what are the disadvantages or the cons. That information is there for you. You don't have to reinvent it. The strategic issue, I have no doubt that, or at least I'm pretty sure, that the Lumina Foundation, a big grant that is being shared by about 30 states, this is one of their examples. Let's change the math pathway for student success. And here's how they described it, quote, to develop a coherent national strategy to guide institutions in over 30 states. And by the way, they don't award to every state that applies, but if each of those 30 states submitted a plan unique to its state of how they could fit in here, they got some financial help to do that, as well as with some great sort of outcome analysis tools to accelerate college-level math completion and help people students finish in 3 or 4 years and not 5 or 6 years. Is AK here today? I talked about all of it, sort of are so uncomfortable with that 6-year measurement rate. On the other hand, even when we know that a lot of our students in community colleges or otherwise, the reason they're taking longer is why, a lot of times? We know sometimes it's because it's easier, but usually it's because they have to work so much. Or they do have to stop out perhaps for a whole semester, or life happens. And so how to keep them completing on that track is critical. Getting closer to home with your strategic plan. The post-secondary attainment rate for adults is 40%. This is according to the Lumina Foundation. But getting underneath those facts, as your data people, as Julie and others have and know, adults who identify as Asian are leading across the country with attainment rates of darn near 60%. and Caucasians at 44%, and in a disheartening fact, which you know, the African Americans and Latinos are down in the 20s. You either know, or perhaps Julie can find, what those completing rates by sector, by group are, because it may affect strategically what you decide to do as a board, how you allocate your scholarship dollars, whether you hire another financial aid literacy assistant. We know that students entering our colleges and universities ill-prepared is a problem. It is something that we have to work with K-12. Commissioner Paredes, I read I was telling you this yesterday, the state of higher education from last year. You give your next address, you said next month. Oh, tomorrow? Today. Dang, I don't get to be here at lunch. Well, I commend to you, if he's kind of boring today, read his last one from, I'm just kidding. Read the one from last year, which I found really, really compelling and heartfelt in a way that, I mean, I've written some of those reports. He uses the first person, and he talks in that one from a year ago about how he kind of struggled with some of the issues. And I found it, you know, very commendable to my colleague, Commissioner. And again, the unpaid political, unsolicited compliment for a leader who's been in his role for a long time. People who do what he and I do. I was commissioner for 9 years, and usually that person in Montana was fired about every 3 years. So I was thrilled to be there for 9 years, and frankly, I think I could still be there. It was my choice to retire, but it's a hard deal. As one president told me back in the 80s, when we went to work with the commissioner in Montana at that time, he said, I'll tell you what, you never want to be the person in that job, the commissioner's job, because they're like the Pope. They might have some moral authority. He kind of scoffed. He said, but they don't have an army. No, if you're in the governing board head role or the coordinating board, you don't, do you, Bobby? You don't have the full alumni complement that a president of one of the big universities or systems has. No, your army is precious little. What you have is this moral authority and the data to say what will be good for Texas as a whole will be good for each of your institutions and will be patriotic. It'll be good for our country. Tom put on deferred maintenance, and I'll concede that's a strategic issue. It's, so I just looked around and found Centenary College in Louisiana. I liked one of the things they said. They started phasing in funding for depreciation, which many of us do not do in our small colleges, maybe a lot of times in our large colleges. What he said, David Rowe, was although 10% of our facilities should have been set aside for deferred maintenance, the college had no funds for this, so they took a different approach. They made it a higher priority, and he said, instead of doing react and repair, we now have a policy of budgeting for depreciation. The new approach, catch up and stay ahead. So, you know, it sounds nice. I think they're doing probably pretty well at it, or he wouldn't be quoted and he wouldn't have gone public. So it is more of a strategic issue on some of your campuses than others, depending on how dependent you are on the physical plant. And then finally, the last two on the strategic issue of people really understanding, is college worth it? And plenty of times you'll get students, they're there, but they're unconvinced, or their families, their parents or their wives or kids, is this really worth it? And there are so many great data points which talk about how worth it is. Let's see if I can find one before I get to, here's one. Is college worth it? Oh, one of my favorites is an article, and I don't know this lady, but it's written by a lady named Catherine Hansen of Quintessential Careers. She wrote an article a year or two ago called, what good is a college education anyway? And then the subtitle, The Value of a College Education. This is one of the favorite articles I've run across in the last year or two by Catherine Hansen. And it lays it out there in a way that is very student-friendly, not just parent-friendly or policymaker-friendly. And her 5 summary points are, it is very likely to make you more prosperous, number 1. Number 2, it will give you a better quality of life. On the whole, nothing's 100%, but on the whole, for most people. 3, she states it rather humbly, it will give you the power to change the world. But when she explicates that, she said it gives you much more confidence in engaging in your school boards, in your local issues and beyond, if you have a college education. It does give you tools, credibility, and more likely to be wind beneath your sails to help change the world. Number 4, it's a legacy. It will be something you pass on to your children. All kinds of information tell us about the difference between families that have college education among one of the parents or both. We talked, Bruce, was it you and I that were talking about the lineman program yesterday? The significant, who was I talking to about that? A program that we've seen change a lot of families where they take a year-long program to get a lineman credential for the energy companies in our state. And I couldn't believe the babies and families that came to that graduation for that credential. And you could see this was going to be life-changing, generationally life-changing. And eventually, with their confidence, some of them were going to change the world and certainly change their families. And finally, she says, Catherine Hansen, on her site, Quintessential Careers, it'll make you more likely to be a major contributor to the greatest nation on earth. It's a good piece. And there I quote her again. So, she says, what more could you ask of your investment in higher education than prosperity, quality of life, the knowledge that bolsters social change, a legacy for your children, and the means to ensure the continuing success of the American dream? So, your task is to take any of those or others not identified strategic issues and plug them into and work with them with your board, because you can't tackle all of them, to make sure that you are meeting and advancing these 4 admirable goals of the 60 by 30 Texas plan. When I looked at it before coming down here, I really think it is such a nice reiteration with some new wrinkles compared to ones I've seen, or even closing the gap. So Bobby, I agree, you were talking as you introduced me, of the extent the people have worked and thought this through. I really think you've got something here, and it will not be easy for each of your institutions to play a role to reach those ambitious figures of 550,000 students in 2030 completing one of those degrees. Whoa, it will, I know you're doing well because of closing the gaps, and you need to do better, but this is something that other states will be watching, I think. And the fact, number 3, that all graduates, this would have reassured my dad, wouldn't it have? That I'm actually going to graduate with a marketable skill, that I didn't just read great literature for 3 or 4 years, and I actually minored in history and philosophy too. I mean, oh, talk about useless, huh? I loved my undergraduate majors and minors and taught for a while, and no one could be more surprised when I got into leadership roles. But I honestly think all the communication skills, the broad sense of the world that I gained through those majors helped me. The Fred Friendly Roundtable, Joe, I'm putting you here on a minute alert because I'm going to ask a couple people to tell me a strategic issue, preferably connected to somehow to the Texas 60 by 30. What's a question you have, which either someone else maybe can answer or maybe I can reflect on? And finally, what we say in AGB a report that our board worked on for a year, a commission chaired by former Governor Brennan of Tennessee. Boards must focus their time on the issues of greatest consequence to the institution by reducing time spent reviewing routine reports and redirecting that attention to cross-cutting and strategic issues not addressed elsewhere. We all know that show and tell is heartwarming. We do want to meet the students. We want to hear their stories, and faculty who are just stars. You do have to have time for that at your board meetings. But if all you're doing is hearing routine reports and you're not getting to this, then you and your board are good but not great. And we are all in the social sector as well as in the business sector trying, to use Colin's expression, we're trying to get to great. That's what your state expects, and it's what it deserves for every dollar that it helps subsidize its future. Not just subsidize students, but to invest in the future of Texas. So with that, I am going to take this and turn it on and move away so I don't make a, should I go this way because so I don't have to jump? That's a really good suggestion, Mary. And we have about 10 more minutes. And so what I would like, and Mark, I think I'm going to start with you, if Mary can get a mic over to you. And I just touched on, I don't know, nearly a couple dozen strategic issues, especially when you include the 60 by 30. Mark, the benefit of your wisdom with a, if you will, a question or a comment on strategic issues for all of us to consider or that are somehow a puzzle to you.
Well,
do you mind standing up for Joe?
Sheila, I stopped and paused because it's a big issue in what I do every day at our new institution, which is an upper-level university, whose intent is to deliberately try to lower the cost of education to the baccalaureate degree by working in direct partnerships with community colleges. The thing that I would like for you to elaborate on a little bit more was that reference you made earlier to the kids, because much of what we do gets measured by very traditional metrics: first-time, full-time students. I have virtually no first-time, full-time students. The average age of my student body is 34. 48% of them are military affiliated, and 59% of them are minority. They are a very diverse group. And as you said, though we're often urged by the legislature, in particular, graduate them faster. Don't let them fool around and waste time. Well, I will tell you, my students are hardly fooling around in terms of getting to a degree.
They are just working so hard.
And so if you could comment a little bit more on that, on the nature of the kids, because most all of us, even in the very large universities that are still drawing very traditional students,
right,
that number of non-traditional students is growing, and to me, that's the basis of 60 by 30. Ultimately, it's going to be that group of individuals
exactly
that we have to reach.
And in some ways, we're fortunate as a country, because one of the ways other countries, by comparison to us, may fall down is they do not have as many people in their 30s and 40s willing to retool. Education is enough of a plus, but I'm making this table nervous because I'm wandering toward Julie or Dave to comment on, maybe it's not the iPads nationally, although that is the National Center on Education Statistics that kind of constrains us sometimes to just measure the traditional approach. Oh, they're going to get a mic. But Julie, how do you handle the data? How do you help inform boards on what he just talked about? So people, frankly, including AK, who I admired everything he said yesterday, And yet, I could hear an underlying assumption that most of our students are maybe not what Mark just described.
Yes, is this working? We show data in several different ways to try to provide information about not only students who might be classified as traditional, but also those who aren't. So of course we do publish graduation rates that track first-time, full-time students, but we also show information, for example, about students who are at community colleges who then move on. So we will show information about here's who completed and earned some kind of a degree or credential, but also who transferred, and also students who are still persisting. So we try to show information about here's students who might not have completed yet, but they're still there. We do 4, 5, 6-year graduation rates and tenure rates. I know IPEDS just last year moved on to having some new measures that look at students in different types of ways, and we at the coordinating board generated that information for the colleges because they don't necessarily know what happened to students when they leave their college, but we at the coordinating board do because we collect information from all of the institutions in the state, including our private institutions. So we can see when did students come in terms of their age, in terms of whether they'd been enrolled somewhere else, and then what happened to them moving forward. So we really are trying to provide a picture that not only provides those traditional comparisons, so you can look at other states' traditional rates and ours, but also that provides information about those non-traditional students.
Right, and David, before you add to that, I just want to say, I heard two parts to what Mark said. I picked up on the part of, let's at least reflect better in data in other ways for our own boards and our communities in our state to understand these just aren't kids. You know, I mean, in many institutions, even flagship institutions, over half, I don't know what it is at your institution, are not, you know, traditional age students. And so I'm sure that's taken into account in some subset action points in the 60 by 30. But David, would you add to that for Mark?
Well, I just wanted to point out we do all the things Julie's talked about, and we've looked at every variation you can imagine since 1987. We've been cutting across, and we added private universities, we added for-profits, but more importantly, if you look at closing the gaps, one of our measures was not a graduation rate, it was the graduates. And so we've been emphasizing graduates for 15 years, understanding that they could start at different points. And I know the commissioner and I have been aware for years that I think we're both concerned about the concept of non-traditional because non-traditional has been traditional in my view for at least 2 decades.
Yeah.
And so if you look, and we probably need to share more broadly the analysis we did for 60 by 30 because we looked at various groups. We know that we have thousands and thousands of students that began college that haven't finished, and part of what we're looking at is getting them back into school.
Some college, no degree, big
invested
category.
A lot of money. The state's invested a lot of money, and we need to get them back. We have something called Grad Techs, where we've got 7 or 8 institutions focusing particularly on how to counsel those students. But we can show you all the elements between more males to, and frankly, we still need more people to go directly from high school to college because that's the largest success rate.
Right.
And will remain so.
Right, and we don't have a lot of time. This is not a workshop, it's just a presentation. But if I were sitting in Mark's shoes, this is something, he said it very eloquently. How do you dig deeper then on that issue with your board to make it fully understood? Data is not good for its own sake, to make it fully understood and therefore both motivating to act on, but empowering to be able to act on what you know, to leverage it and improve that answer, that statistic. And now, I thought, and Yvonne and Bruce and Calhoun and all kind of people, Gerald, are off the hook, because I thought I would have more time. And if this were a full morning workshop, you wouldn't be off the hook at all. But it's just my hour, and Mary's gonna, you know, whop me upside the head here in a minute. So I'll just conclude to say the workshops and retreats and time you spend at boards, at your board meetings, need to sort of hear what your CEO says. This is something I struggle with, that we are struggling with. We can never do our part here unless we fully understand it. And then, fully understanding it, because you actually, I think, have a much better data source than a lot of states, what do we do about it? So that's just one example. My time is up. I would love to just be, having a workshop all day, and you're probably thinking, whew, she does have to catch a plane. And Commissioner Ray, I regret that I don't get to be here, but I'm going to be looking for a copy to see the state of your state of higher education, because as I say, I was really quite moved by your one from last year, all the thought, effort, work, how faculty, how do we get everyone more engaged in financial literacy and everything else. So let me just say, what a pleasure on behalf of the Association of Governing Boards, on behalf of the Lumina Foundation, it is for us, for me, to be invited to at least explore some of these issues with you. And I hope to get you just fired up about those board meetings. They're few and far between. Well, maybe some of you have too many. If you're community colleges, you probably have too many of them. But some of them, or it's just that routine, yes, the financial report looks pretty good this month, and then you feel really good about it. No! Somebody's got to do that and double check it, the committee, but get on to the strategic issues. And with that, thank you very much.